What I'd like to do today is I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of checks and balances. And in the United States, under the Constitution that we have a system of checks and balances. You've probably heard people say this many times. And I wanted to elaborate on it a little bit because I think it might not be talked about thoroughly enough what exactly that means. One of the things that we always think about when we think of checks and balances, we think of, in the United States, we have the three branches of government, right? We have the executive, we have the judiciary, and we have the legislative branch. And these three branches, they're co-equal branches, and they all share power with one another. But the system that we have was actually designed a little bit more intricately than that. And that's kind of what I want to talk. I think the checks and balances don't end with three branches necessarily. But we do have the three branches, so I'll go over those briefly. So we know that we have the executive branch, right? The office of presidency and the military and all the bureaucracy that falls underneath the executive branch, those who are responsible for executing the laws. Now, they are not the ones who write the laws, although some people argue that bureaucracy is responsible for creating too many regulations and therefore they're becoming a legislative agency, which is not good. You can make the case for that. We have the executive branch, and they're responsible for executing the laws. Then we also have the legislative branch. So the legislative branch is what we call Congress in the United States. It consists of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It's a bicameral legislature. There are two different houses that together have to come together and make laws. So Congress writes the laws. And then you have the judiciary. And the best way to think about the judiciary is like referees in a sporting event. The judiciary is not supposed to make laws. Again, some people argue that some judges try and legislate from the bench. But ideally, the judiciary is the referee. So they say the executive can or cannot do this particular action. The legislative branch may have passed a law. We deem it to be illegal or unconstitutional. So when they say illegal, if we're talking about the Supreme Court, what they should be assessing is this act of Congress or is this action taken by the executive branch, is it prohibited by the Constitution? Is it constitutional or not? Does it have the power to do so? And it also regulates things under the Constitution that have to do with the shared power between the federal government and the state governments. The court system is designed to be the referee in determining that. And that's the next thing that I actually wanted to talk about was federalism. It's not just the three different branches of government that compete for power, but we also have 50 state governments and other governments that are within our system, but the 50 states share power with the federal government. Before I talk about federalism, just a note that I want to make is that elections themselves are a check on our government. So every 2 years we have elections on the national level. So we elect the House of Representatives every 2 years. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the United States Senate is up for re-election. And then, of course, every 4 years, there's a presidential election where the Electoral College decides who's going to be the next president of the United States. So what that does is it limits what politicians can get away with, right? If a politician is too corrupt, steps out of bounds too much, arguably, ideally, we can vote these people out of office. And even those who are capable of staying in office, we should be grateful that we live in a system where our leaders attempt to hide their corruption. In a lot worse systems, they don't necessarily have to hide it as much. But to a very large degree, the elected officials in this country are they are beholden to us. They work for the people of the United States. Ideally, that's how our system is set up. So, elections are a check. We have the three different branches of government competing for power. We hold regular elections, and we have federalism. We have states that in our Constitution, the states are given certain rights and certain powers, and the federal government is given certain rights, responsibilities, and powers. Now, over the years, the federal government has gotten bigger and has acquired more and more power. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that is how our system has evolved up until this point. There's a clause in the Constitution referred to as the Commerce Clause, and it gives power to Congress to regulate commerce across state lines. A lot of things can fall underneath the Commerce Clause. It gives Congress to regulate pretty much any industry or any product in the United States. It's how the government technically has the ability to criminalize something like marijuana at a federal level, because it all falls under the Commerce Clause, and many, many, many different things fall under the Commerce Clause. So, I've spoken about federalism, and I've spoken about how the states have a certain amount of power, and the federal government has a certain amount of power. The Electoral College is something else that's discussed a lot. Some people have problems with it. A lot of people, myself included, believe that it is very wise to maintain, and it is brilliant for maintaining the system. The Electoral College is what is used to choose the President of the United States. This is a check on the federal government. It's a check on democracy. So, what this does is this allows for each state has a certain amount of electors that are selected by the populations of those states to go and vote for the president. This allows for flip states to come about. There are some states that become flip states. Some states may go one direction, other states may go another direction, and what this does is this keeps every state relevant in determining each presidential election. For example, in the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, Florida was considered the state that determined everything because it was such a narrow margin in Florida that votes had to be recounted and everything else. But in reality, because the vote was so close, an election in West Virginia or an election in Iowa, all these places, they were relevant. The several votes that all these states have, they are relevant. Without the Electoral College, you could have California and New York decide every election. Large populations, the metropolitan vote would always have the voice, and it would be detrimental to the middle class. That's its own little video that I should make later. So I mentioned the word democracy. So many people say that we're a democracy. A lot of people use the word democracy. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't, depending on your definition. However, the checks and balances that I'm talking about, the checks and balances are designed, we have checks on democracy itself, okay? For example, the elections that we have are staggered elections. So what do I mean by that? Why don't we elect the president, the Senate, and the House of Representatives all at the same time, right? We would know every 4 years, every 5 years, whatever you want, in like a parliamentary system, we could elect all the leaders at the same time, and the will of the people would be very clear. We don't do that. Instead, the House is elected every 2 years, the Senate is chosen every 6 years, the President is chosen every 4 years, and so there's kind of like a rotation of national interests going on. The reason for that, sometimes things become very something is in the public arena very loud and clear for a very short period of time. And what happened in ancient Athens, for example, is people would vote on something one day and the next day they'd want to reverse the vote. And so it was very chaotic. So what this does is it creates a smooth transition to where people's interests are being represented in Congress. However, you have people who are elected at different times for different reasons, and ideally you get a consensus, and that which is in the best interest, that which has been thought through thoroughly enough, is what is enacted. Hopefully, that's how it's designed. And we have a rotating Senate, which is very closely related to what I'm saying. So we have a Senate of the United States. The Senate has 2 senators from every state. The House of Representatives represents the people at large, right? Much more democratic in that sense. So you are given a number of representatives based off of the population of your state. But every state, because of federalism, every state has the same amount of senators. However, they have 6-year terms, but we don't elect them all every 6 years. Every 2 years, we elect 1/3 of them. What this does is this allows for institutional memory, one thing, so you have experienced politicians, leaders within the Senate who kind of carry the mantle. You have experienced members who are more aware of what's going on, as opposed to entering freshman members. But it also prevents hasty decision making within the Senate. So if I know I'm going to be reelected next year, and I'm a senator, I can make a decision. I could want a vote on a piece of legislation that's going to benefit me. Perhaps I'm retiring next year. We'll say that. Perhaps I'm retiring next year, and there's a piece of legislation that I think is going to benefit me. Perhaps I think it's going to benefit my constituents. Someone who's going to be up for re-election down the road may not agree to vote for my legislation because they are still beholden to elections and at a different time. So elections are going to affect the actions taken by senators at certain times. So you don't have a large body of people saying, well, we're no longer running for re-election, or whatever the case may be. My election's not for another 6 years, so oftentimes things get swept under the rug as far as public opinion goes, and I'll behave my latter 3 years, but my former 3 years, maybe we can get away with more. There's different ways you can explain this, but a rotating Senate is a check on the Senate. It's a check on democracy. We don't want to just we don't want just popular opinion to always be voted on right away. There's a procedure. We want time to go by. We want the actions taken by the government to be thought through and in the best interest of not just 51%. We want to make decisions that are in the best interest of the vast majority. So we have a rotating Senate, which is a check on democracy. We have elections every 2, 4, and 6 years, staggered elections. This is a check on democracy. We also have a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, arguably, it's a check on democracy. What do I mean by that? Well, if democracy can be thoroughly trusted, and we have elected leaders, and for more or less they do the will of the people, why do we even need a Bill of Rights? Even in a system where people elect their own leaders, the people themselves cannot vote through their leaders, cannot vote for measures that would infringe upon the rights of minorities. So, for example, we have free speech. The First Amendment, for example, is in the Bill of Rights. So, 60% of members of Congress could not vote to outlaw a website or anything being published, any idea. They cannot silence a voice that they don't like. 60% could not infringe upon the right of a minority. You have an absolute right to free speech. Now, people want to argue with me and they want to say that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not speech, but I don't want to get into that right now. That's another debate. The Second Amendment is also within the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment is also part of the system of checks and balances that I'm talking about. The Second Amendment exists despite a lot of demagoguery and nonsense that you'll hear from not very credible news organizations and things like that. The Second Amendment exists so that people have the ability to overthrow a tyrannical government, a government that becomes abusive and infringes upon the rights of the individuals. The Second Amendment exists so that people have the right to overthrow the government. That is why it is in there. And that is in one of our founding documents, by the way. It's in the Declaration of Independence, which is a non-legal document, but it very much shapes the character of who we are, and it gives you an idea, it gives us an idea of the founding political philosophy of the United States. This is what the founding generation believed in. And yes, it was the right of the people to overthrow a government. Having the ability, though hopefully we never have to use it, having the ability to do so is a check on the government. Now you could argue that our system of government was set up with the idea in mind that people can't be trusted. Now that's a very negative way to look at it. You could also, another way to word it is that our system was set up with an understanding that too much power concentrated in any one particular area will corrupt and erode the entire system. That may be a better way to say it. But our system was set up to where we have three branches of government always competing for power. That's healthy. That's good. Competition for power means we don't want any branch to be able to dominate another branch. We don't want any group of people being capable of dominating any other group. We do not want that in this country. We have checks and balances for that reason. Now, the Constitution itself, we'll talk about checks and balances, was not ratified with the idea of democracy involved. As a matter of fact, every state that joined the Union ratified the Constitution, but before it was ratified, there was an agreement that 9 out of the 13 states would have to ratify it for it to even go into effect to begin with. Now, all the states eventually ended up ratifying it, but it was not 51% vote for it. There's a process. It's not about democracy. It's about legitimacy. So democracy is about what 51% of the people want. Legitimacy and constitutional government is about what is in the best interests of the vast majority of the people. What is in the best interest of everyone, ideally. So the constitutional amendment process, even if we are to change the fundamental law of the land, which is the Constitution of the United States, even if we want to amend it, still 51% can't decide to change the Constitution. First, you'd have to have, I believe, in most cases, this is how it works. 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate must vote to amend the Constitution, and then 3/4 of all the states must agree to ratify it. So if 60% of the states vote to amend the Constitution, it does not become law of the land. It is not the will of the majority. It is the will of the overwhelming majority. Because 100% consensus is not possible and would also cause the system to decay. So we set up a system to where the overwhelming majority can affect the law of the land with safeguards in place to protect minorities. So what we have, I argue, and will argue in a later video, is that we do not have democracy per se. There are democratic elements within our system. But what we want, we do not want rule of 51%. We want rule of law. And what is the fundamental law of the United States? The fundamental law of the United States is the Constitution of the United States, which was ratified by every state in the Union. And to change the Constitution of the United States requires consensus from 3/4 of the states within the Union in order to change it. There have been thousands of attempts to amend the Constitution, and there's only been 27 actual successful attempts, because it's a difficult process, but it is possible. So we can change it if it needs to be changed. But what we want is rule of law. So if we don't have... So what is it that has all... Why is it that the legislature agrees to this, relatively speaking? Why is it that the elected leaders, that the legislature remains within their power, so to speak? Maybe we step out of bounds here and there. Why is it that the judiciary respects the system? Why isn't it that the executive just does whatever they want? Why not? What's to stop the executive? Well, many different things. We have checks and balances, but what we have is we have legitimacy, all right? We have the legitimacy of the system. We may not agree on all the policies and the politics that occur on smaller levels within our system, but we all, the overwhelming consensus within the United States is, whether I'm a Republican, whether I'm a Democrat, whether I'm black or white, whether I'm male, female, I acknowledge that the Constitution of the United States is the political sovereign of the land. And because I accept that this system is fair for me, it's fair for my family, it's fair for my friends, and it's fair for everyone within the country, I accept that it is the law of the land, and I submit to the Constitution as my political sovereign. I am happy to do that, and I will delegate a small piece of my freedom to this political entity, to this idea, to this document known as the Constitution of the United States. Now, it's just a document all by itself. What gives it power, what gives it strength, and what has given us the ability to operate underneath the Constitution for over 200 years is this word legitimacy. It has the legitimacy of the people. It is the social contract that we all agree to. And it's only in recent days where people have actually been questioning the legitimacy of this document, with the exception of nullification in the Civil War and debates that were going back then. I'm not talking about that. But we have always acknowledged that it's the social contract. Now, some people will say, well, what about slaves, and what about women? What about people who weren't necessarily included and all them? Okay. The question was not whether this document is legitimate. The question is not whether the social contract is legitimate. The question was, how do we include people who are not already included in the social contract? How do we include them in the social contract? Not do we void the social contract. Not is the social contract obsolete. How do we include people so that everybody falls under this umbrella, so that everybody falls under this social contract? And the social contract is the Constitution of the United States, and it is what gives us the best life possible politically, and in combination with political stability. We have a very stable system. We have the oldest system of government in the world. We have the oldest constitution in the world. We are not the oldest nation in the world, but we have had stability and a democratic process longer than any other country in the world. And it is because of the strength of the Constitution. It is because the Constitution includes checks and balances. And it's because it has the legitimacy of the people. A legitimacy of the people who come from all nations of the world, has the legitimacy of men and women, people of all races, people from different regions within the country who have different, perhaps ideological worldviews, religious worldviews. It has the legitimacy of the people. And it's a miraculous achievement. We are still going strong. The system of checks and balances should be maintained. The Constitution of the United States should be maintained. And it can only do so with the legitimacy of the people. It can only do so if the people agree to continue to respect the system that we currently have. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative. I'm going to make videos in the future. I'd appreciate it if you like my videos and subscribe to my channel. share this video, and until the next video, that's what I have to say today.